All right. So, welcome today to our discussion of reform movements in the United States. So, today is going to kind of be the introduction and the overview to why the 1820s and 1830s are super fertile time periods for reform. Um, I'm going to give sort of a broad sampling of different kinds of reform movements, but I'm going to leave it to your textbook to talk in a little bit more detail about two really specific reform movements, abolition and then feminism or women's rights, because we just don't have enough time in 50 minutes to cover everything, all of the reform movements in the chapter. And I really do think like those are significant enough that they deserve their own sort of section. And in fact, during the fall 2020 semester, I did a segment on feminism during this time period. So I'll try to also put that one up too, in case y'all want to view it later. I try to vary the topics from semester to semester so that way I'm building a library of recordings. All right, so we're going to talk about reform movements. And first, let's talk about what is reform and why do we see a lot of reform during this time period. So, there's a couple different reasons why we're seeing reform. And when we're talking about reform, we don't just mean political reform, right? Like reform through passing laws to fix things. We also mean social reform movements. So, in other words, people working with voluntary organizations to try to improve society. So, the root cause of this was people believing that, number one, reform was necessary, okay, that there are things in society that need to be fixed. And then number two, that reform was possible, either again through sort of social cooperation or some cases through laws. And this is a very sort of similar zest for reform that we see in History 1302 with the Progressive Era movement in the early 1900s. So we kind of have these cycles of people believing that reform is necessary and possible. So we're going to be focusing on the 1820s through the 1840s today, because these decades really see a push for a lot of different reform movements. Part of this is there's a lot of increasing political agitation, people seeing maybe the possibility of bringing the government in to make these changes and improvements. So there's lots of like political clubs. We also see churches as really important agencies of reform, which we're going to talk about more in a second. And there's lots of different causes that people are focusing on. One is alcohol. That's a really big one. That becomes a very persistent movement in the United States, which will eventually result in the 18th Amendment, which enacts prohibition. So it prohibits the sale and manufacture of alcohol from 1920 to 1933, I believe, 34, somewhere in there. It was really quickly after FDR came in as president that they got rid of prohibition. Um, there's also pushes to restrict certain activities on Sundays to honor the holiness of the holiday. Again, we're still a predominantly Christian society in the United States during this time period. There's pushes for increasing access to education, refining how we deal with mental illness, talking about reforming the correctional system. So we'll talk a little bit about prisons today, and then also addressing the issue of poverty. So there are all these different kinds of areas where people see the need for reform. No one person is necessarily going to have the same opinion on what that reform should look like across all these different areas. Some people might advocate for reform in some areas, but not others, as we're going to talk about. But these are just some of the examples of the really sort of big topics in reform movements at this time. Reforms are also mostly concentrated in the North. Um, Very few movements with the exception of temperance, which is the movement to try to regulate or then eventually ban alcohol, very few movements are really popular in the South. And there's a lot of reasons for this, as we'll talk about. Now, there are differing tactics of how you go about reforming. There are sort of like three main ways that people try to enact reforms during this time period. The first one is what we call moral suasion. So, if you're thinking suasion, that sounds like the word persuasion, you are right. So, moral suasion is a tactic where you try to convince people that the activity that you don't like is a sin, it's wrong. And if you appeal to their sense of morality, then you may convince them to reform their behavior. So, for example, abolitionists tried to say, look, slavery is sinful, so that's why we want to get rid of it. And, you know, it went against an abolitionist interpretation of the Bible, although as you all are reading in this chapter, the Bible is also used by pro-slavery advocates. But if you're convincing people that slavery is a sin, then that's going to push them to free their slaves immediately, right? None of this gradual emancipation like we'd seen in a lot of states, because if something's wrong, it's a sin, and you believe it's wrong, you want to stop doing it immediately, right? You don't want to be like, I'm going to taper off my level of sinning over time. Okay, not like that. So moral suasion, try to appeal to someone's sense of morality to convince them a certain behavior is wrong and needs to be corrected. The second kind of tactic of reform movements is legislation. Use the government to legislate morality. And this is not going to be quite as popular during this time period as it will during the later progressive movement, but it's definitely a tactic that some people try. Trying to do things like, for example, I'll give you a concrete example here in Texas. In Texas, there are certain laws about alcohol. One of those laws is that you can't buy alcohol before noon on a Sunday. And I always forget this, and I do my grocery shopping on Sunday morning, and sometimes I'll get excited if I see like a new variety of like my favorite cider brewery, and I'll try to buy it, and they'll be like, ma'am, it's before noon on a Sunday, you can't do that. I'll be like, dang it, I forgot it was Sunday. So that is an example of a law that's designed to curb behavior. So in this case, they want to curb alcohol sales by putting restrictions on it, right? Now, there are always loopholes, as we'll see throughout the rest of 1301 and 1302. Like, for example, living here in El Paso, what's a loophole to get around that you can't buy booze before noon on a Sunday? What could I do instead if I really wanted to buy like beer or wine? Any ideas?
Go to a bar.
Well, bars can't sell it either.
Oh.
There is a loophole for brunch.
Oh, okay.
So I could like, you know, go to brunch and there's a loophole for mimosas being served. But I'm not a mimosa person. I could go across the state line to New Mexico, which doesn't have that law. Or, you know, like I could just buy my booze another day of the week, right, and store it up. So like there are loopholes. Like we live on the border of with another state and with Mexico. So for us, it's super easy. It's a little bit harder for somebody to navigate that if they live, like, say, in the middle of the country. But there are always loopholes people get around. And the alcohol laws is definitely one of the more sort of sources of creative loopholes. Like some people like will just make their own, for example. All right, so there's legislation, which again is imperfect because people find ways to get around the rules. And then the last kind of tactic of reform is to withdraw. So these are people who've decided that the best way to get people to come around to their point of view is to kind of check out from mainstream society and set up their own sort of version of society to model what they see as perfect behavior. So that's what we call utopian communities, which we'll talk about in more detail shortly. Okay, so the three attempts that we see in these reform movements to try to convince people to adopt these reforms is moral suasion, legislation, and withdrawing from society. So religion is a really big component in this wave of reform from the 1820s to the 1840s. And a lot of this has to do with a religious movement called the Second Great Awakening. Y'all are reading more detail about the Second Great Awakening in your textbook. I'll just kind of briefly cap it up here. The Second Great Awakening is this wave of religious revivalism across the United States and the first couple of decades of the 1800s. It creates a fervor and enthusiasm for religion, and this is within Protestant Christianity. We don't really see this within like Catholic Christianity or other religions at this time. But also the Great Awakening creates this social consciousness because the Second Great Awakening paints people as moral free agents. So unlike the earlier Puritans that we talked about in the first couple weeks of the semester, who believed in predestination, that whatever you did, whatever actions you did in life would not affect your eternal fate because God had already decided whether you were saved or damned when you were born. The Second Great Awakening folks believe that you have the power to determine your fate, right? Your relationship with Jesus Christ, right? You accepting him as your savior, that is what sort of saves you, right? There's no more predestination going on. But it also emphasizes that people have choices. People have the freedom to make choices, and they can choose badly or they could choose morally. And so the idea of this, that people have morality, that people have the power to make these choices surrounding morality, is really going to drive reform movements, right? Because that kind of feeds into that tactic of moral suasion. If somebody's predestined, they're not going to buy your argument that they need to reform their behavior, right? Because their fate's already sealed. There is also, alongside this religious movement within Protestant Christianity, a parallel belief that's very popular called perfectionism. This belief that society continually progresses, that it was possible that mankind, both as individuals and societies, could become perfect. And this belief impacts reform movements, in part because it makes them a little bit more extreme. So a great example of this is the temperance movement. So temperance is a word. If you look it up in the dictionary, temperance means moderation. So the original goal of the temperance movement, found by groups like the American Temperance Society in 1826, originally the temperance movement wanted to just reduce people's alcohol consumption, not eliminate it. To give you an idea, in 1830, the average American is consuming 7 gallons of alcohol a year. Today, the average American's annual consumption of alcohol is closer to 2 gallons. Okay, so almost a quarter of that level in 1830. Why are people drinking so much in 1830? Any ideas? Why so much booze consumption?
Probably because of everything going on and all the wars that had just finished and all the issues. Like
Yeah, I mean,
arising.
there's a lot going on, right? We've talked about the Industrial Revolution. It makes life hard for a lot of people, very different, lots of changes, right? Um, there's also the culture surrounding drinking is different. There's no age limit on alcohol consumption. There's also the fact that water quality still sucks. And alcohol kills germs and bacteria. So a lot of times it's safer to drink cider or beer than it is actual water. So that's part of it too. So when we say people are consuming, 7 gallons of alcohol a year on average per person, that's not to say they're walking around stumbling drunk all the time. The tolerance is different. The consumption is spread out. They're not like binge drinking for the most part, for example. But there were some folks who were binge drinking, and there were some folks who were coping with all of these rapid changes in American society by turning increasingly to the bottle. And this belief in perfectionism, that it's possible to achieve perfection, means that the groups like the American Temperance Society are going to shift to going from just getting people to drink less to trying to get the ultimate goal of banning alcohol completely rather than just moderating it. So this is where the temperance movement shifts from trying to moderate to try to ban alcohol consumption. And their efforts do succeed in moderating it at first. For example, by 1840, alcohol consumption had dropped down by half of its 1830 level. So people are drinking less, but that's not enough for the American Temperance Society. They want to get rid of alcohol consumption completely. And this is going to appeal a lot to Protestant Christians, not so much to Catholic Christians. Why would Catholic Christians not be down to completely ban alcohol?
Because of the communion?
Yeah, because of communion. What do you use during communion? What represents the blood of Christ?
Red wine, I think.
Red wine, right. Okay. Or if you're Methodist like I am, which is like what we call Catholic light, same formality but less guilt, you use grape juice. But yeah, so Catholics have wine as part of their communion, right? So they're not so down on completely banning alcohol. Sippy, are you sign? You don't drink. All right. I did give them a toy martini, a stuffed martini once, and she confiscated it from her brother. All right. So there was no booze in it. It was just a stuffed squeaky toy. All right, reform and freedom. So the clash between Protestant Christians who are more likely to favor a complete ban of alcohol and Catholic Christians who are like, well, no, wine is part of our communion, represents this debate over, can you legislate morality? Because increasingly the temperance movement wanted to pass laws to ban alcohol production and consumption. So many people argued that, well, if you're legislating morality, which is what you're trying to do here by saying you can't do X behavior, whose morality are you going to legislate? Because, if you say we're going to ban alcohol, well, then you're restricting Catholics from practicing their religion the way that they do with using wine as communion, right? So you're not using their morality, you're using somebody else's morality. So many people argued that because of what we call cultural pluralism, our population is very diverse, lots of different cultures, lots of different belief systems. You really can't legislate morality besides the big basics that most of us agree upon. Like, for example, it's bad to kill people, right? We can all agree on that. That's perfectly fine to legislate. But when it comes to things like alcohol consumption, that's tricky. Many people argued that if we legislated morality, we're restricting freedom. And it comes back to that old debate that we talked about in the context of the Puritans and John Winthrop, right, in chapter 2, of natural liberty versus moral or Christian liberty. If you remember that document by John Winthrop that was in your textbook, he talked about the fact that natural liberty was complete freedom, that people had the choice to do whatever. And he argued that that was too much freedom, that meant that people could choose to do bad things. So the opposite of that was what he called moral or Christian liberty, meaning that you could legislate to encourage people to do the right thing. So, for example, and again, using the temperance movement, banning alcohol, or at least putting restrictions on it, like Texas has, where you can't buy it before noon on a Sunday, you're encouraging people to adopt better behavior, more moral behavior around alcohol consumption. you're not giving them the choice. And if they choose to violate the law, then they suffer the punishment for it, right? So there's that idea that legislating morality is in the best interest of society, that you're taking away the opportunity for people to make bad choices according to your version of morality. We see this a lot with, again, Protestant Christianity in the United States has a very long history of this. The American Tract Society is a very popular group during this time period, and they actually distributed more than 500 million pages of pamphlets between 1825 and 1835, making arguments for legislating morality, doing things like encouraging governments to ban alcohol sales, or to ban things like prostitution or swearing or other kinds of activities like betting in sports. So this is a really kind of tricky definition, right? Because you don't want to impinge on someone's freedom, but you also want society to kind of have like basic rules and standards. And so really the argument, which we're still having this argument today, right? Can you think of any example that we have today of laws that some people say are necessary for morality, but other people say are needlessly restricting? Can you think of any other sort of hot button issues about behavior and choice? I can think of one very clearly at the top of my head. Go ahead.
Abortion is like a huge one.
Sorry, you're having a bark fest apparently. Yes, abortion is a huge one, right? Like, how do you solve that kind of, well, morally, some people think abortion is wrong in their religion. Others, their religion doesn't have a problem with it. Then you have the bodily autonomy question, right?
Yes.
There's also marijuana, right? So we live in El Paso, and in Texas, it's illegal, but our neighbor in New Mexico just legalized it, right? So there are some people saying, well, marijuana smoking is not good behavior, and so you should make it illegal. And there are others going, well, just make it legal, but put restrictions on it, right? So there's all kinds of issues. We're still having this discussion, right, today. Just the issues are different. So we're not necessarily talking about alcohol anymore, but definitely about things like marijuana would be the closest analog to the alcohol conversation. All right. So as I talked about, one of the other methods to try to get reform is to model the behavior, ideally in your version of what a perfect society should look about. And this is what we call utopian communities. So the word utopia comes from a novel published in the 1500s by Thomas More. And a utopia is an ideal community. So you're trying to create in a utopia what you think society should look like. And we have about 100 different utopian communities established in the United States before the Civil War. There are a lot of different kinds of utopian communities, but there are some things that all utopian communities have in common. Many of them have some form of socialism or communism. This attempt to make people socially and economically equal by eliminating private ownership of property. Again, on a small scale within their own community. There's also a lot of unconventional gender roles going on in utopian communities. Again, recognizing the influence of patriarchy or male power in society and trying to balance that by making a little bit more gender equality in their societies, and recognizing that according to the American legal system, still during this time period, women are considered to essentially be property still during this time period, property of their husbands when they got married. Now, we have both religious and secular utopian communities. Religious communities tend to be longer lasting than secular ones because religion is the glue that holds them together. But regardless of what the utopian communities look like, their goal is to create this perfect model society that the rest of the world can look at and copy. So not unlike the Puritan notion of that city on a hill, right? That their Massachusetts settlement was going to be the model of a perfect society that everyone else could follow. So let's look at two very famous utopian communities, the Shakers and the Oneida, who are very different from each other. So the Shakers, by the way, still exist today, although in very small numbers. At their peak in the 1840s, the Shakers had about 5,000 members in the United States. And this illustration is of a Shaker meeting that you see on the slide. Mother Ann Lee was an English woman who was considered to be the founder of the Shakers. She had visions and said that God told her to take her followers and immigrate to the United States to establish their perfect community. The Shakers believed God had both male and female attributes, and therefore men and women were seen as equal within Shaker communities. Now, the Shakers had a really interesting idea. They believed in virgin purity, meaning no sex allowed. Okay. So, how do you grow your religious community if you can't have sex and therefore kids? What do you got to do?
Adopt.
Yeah, you adopt, and so lots of Shaker communities adopted orphans. You convert, right? You proselytize to people, and so that's what the Shakers do. So the Shakers, again, still in existence today, very small numbers, and they have to bring in converts, right? It's always voluntary. Even when the communities raise orphans, once the kids are old enough, they have the choice to stay in the community or leave. Shaker communities featured communal living, so everyone's working together, splitting their work equally. Their religious services include dancing, which you see here, and that gave their nickname the Shakers, because the dancing was kind of this like weird sort of frenetic, jerky movement. People make jokes that they're just, burning off their excess sexual frustration because they can't have sex. Um, Shaker communities supported themselves in a couple different ways. They become one of the first communities to sell organic seeds commercially in the United States, herbal medicine, and they also become known for furniture making, which is where we get the Shaker style of furniture today. Shaker's style is very popular still, especially in cabinets, like kitchen cabinets, because the shaker style furniture is very sort of clean lines, very timeless sort of style. Then on the other end of the spectrum, we have the Oneidans. The Oneidans, again, also counts as a religious community. The community is founded in 1848 by John Humphrey Noyes, and I accidentally left off his last name on my slide. Noyes preached that his followers had become perfect and sinless. But to maintain that level of perfection, you had to rigidly stick to the rules and the principles of the Oneida community. And one of those rules is the concept of free love. Oneida, as a community, recognized that women were sort of oppressed in the American legal system and by the patriarchy. And so they said, rather than continue to perpetuate marriage as an institution, what we're going to do is we're going to say we engage in complex marriage. So in other words, all men in Oneida are married to all women in Oneida. So there's no sort of legal marriage like we see in the United States system, but this idea that everybody is sort of in this very big marriage. As such, you could sleep with whoever you wanted, but there's a community record book. Okay, so basically a hookup book. And the way that this worked was that men would get to go and put down in this book the woman they wanted to sleep with. The woman could say no, but she was encouraged not to. Why would you record this in a book? I mean, it seems weird, right? Why would you record who's hooking up with who?
I have no clue other than maybe to avoid any like girls saying that they didn't want to have sex with them.
Yeah, you could definitely kind of be like, okay, it's out in the open, right? That this person expressed interest. There's also the fact that you can try to avoid forming monogamous relationships, which were forbidden in Oneida. You had to be more sort of like you get kicked out if you were monogamous with a person. There's also the fact that if there's an oops in a pregnancy, you want to be able to establish paternity, right? This is before the age of Maury Povich and DNA testing. Um, they were trying not to have kids, in fact, because Noyes said one of the highest things that men could do was to have sex without finishing. And so that's hard for dudes. And so basically, young men would be encouraged to practice having sex without orgasm. And in order to practice and again kind of minimize accidental pregnancies, these young men were paired with menopausal women, so women who could not have kids anymore. So my husband likes to say, yes, in Oneida, young men are having sex with gilfs, grandmothers. And then, when they showed sort of sufficient skill at having sex without orgasm, then they were allowed to sleep with younger women. By the 1860s, the community is starting to dictate which couples could reproduce, an early form of eugenics. And the Oneinans, unsurprisingly, after the death of Noyes, will fall apart. But there's still a legacy of Oneida today, and that is the way that they made money. If you go to Walmart or Target and you go shopping in the home goods section, you will still find Oneida silverware, which is owned by the descendants of the Oneida colony. So again, definite legacies within the home of both the Shaker and Oneida colonies. We do have secular utopian communities, but they don't tend to last as long. One famous one is Brook Farm, founded by a group of transcendentalists who were really taken with this idea of communal living established by this Frenchman named Charles Fourier. Brook Farm was supposed to be an intellectually stimulating environment, but many members just wanted to sit and think all day and not do the manual labor necessary to sustain the community, so it collapses pretty quickly. The Owenites are another group, again, kind of this notion that there is an ideal community design similar to Brook Farm. In this case, Robert Owen, and he's kind of an interesting architect of a utopian community because he was actually a British factory owner, and he believed that the problems of modern workers could be solved through communal living. And so he establishes his first idealized community in Scotland. And then in the United States, a community constructed based on his ideas is established in New Harmony, Indiana in 1824. It doesn't really end well. There's lots of perpetual squabbling. But some of Owen's ideas, not so much about community design, are still with us today. Owen envisioned a world in which there would be universal access to education, that women would be equal with men, and then he believed that providing a nurturing environment and universal education would help improve people's lives. And so we see Owen's lasting influence on not so much utopian communities, but more on labor movements and women's rights movements. So a couple of other, just to kind of sum up today, this will be our last slide. There are some other reform movements going on as well. There's a reform to change how we deal with both mental illness and crime. Both the asylum movement and the prison movement were a part of a trend towards building institutions and locating things that had been dealt with in prior generations at home or at the broader community level to dedicated places to serve individuals. So, for example, mental illness was something that before, again, not really well understood at this time. And if you had a family member who was mentally ill, ideally you took care for them at home. But if they became more than you could handle, the only place really to send your mentally ill relative was to the local jail and basically put them in to the prison system. Similarly, the idea of dealing with crime is also changing. Prior to this, if someone committed a crime in the community, very often their punishment was very public through things like you often see stereotyped at Puritan villages like the stocks, right, where your arms and head are kind of through this thing and you're put on public display, or very public executions for capital crimes, things like public hangings or drawing and quartering, which is literally ripping someone apart by tying limbs to horses that move in different directions. It's very unpleasant. But the purpose of public punishment for crime was to serve as a deterrent or a warning to anybody else who might be complicating breaking the law. However, because of the belief in perfectionism that's dominant in the society, we move towards treating mental illness in asylums or dedicated institutions that are meant to treat people with mental illness compassionately and try to treat them. Although, again, the understanding of the causes of mental illness and thus the treatment is very imperfect at this time. And then similarly, for people who broke the law, rather than public humiliation as a deterrent, there's an attempt to create the prison system where they can spend time and be reformed and rehabilitated and then released back in society as an improved person. That is a far cry from our understanding of the prison system today, which tends to be a place where we just toss people in to keep them away from and separate from society. And there's far less emphasis on reforming the individual that's in prison today than there was originally during this movement in the 1800s. The legacy of Robert Owen's belief in universal education we see in the Common School movement, and one of the Americans most associated with this movement is a man named Horace Mann. He was the director of the Massachusetts Board of Education, and he was a big proponent towards establishing a public school system. Prior to this, access to education is highly dependent upon where you live. What we saw is in the old sort of Puritan, the states that previously were Puritan colonies, there tended to be local schools set up because the Puritans placed a high priority on reading, so you could read the Bible for yourself. But in many places, you could only get education if you could afford to send your kids to a private school or hire a tutor. And so there's this move towards universal education to establish a government-run system of schools for a couple of reasons. One is to help make society more equal. That education is seen as a ticket to get people out of poverty. That if you give a poor kid an education, they are more likely to be able to break the cycle of poverty that their family is in. There's also this belief that giving students access to public education and spending a lot of time each day with teachers and other authority figures will help balance out bad or neglectful parenting at home by giving kids alternate authority figures. There's also the sense that the way that education is structured will provide discipline to students and basically make it so that children are more conditioned for the workforce later on. I mean, think about it, this idea that you have to go to classes at a particular time, that you have to sit still, that you have to pay attention, that you have to follow rules. This is all kind of setting you up for a future in the workplace. By 1860, pretty much all northern states had established public schools funded by a system of taxes. And a lot of the teachers in these early public school systems were women. This is one of the sort of few professional opportunities available to women during this time period. The South lags behind on access to public education, partly because rich Southerners could already afford to send their kids to private school. And they didn't really see the need to set up a system of taxes to help educate kids who weren't theirs. Even still today, public schools are largely founded off of property taxes, meaning that if you live in an area that property is valued higher, there's more tax revenues, so the schools will tend to be better quality, versus if you live in an area of lower value, less money for the schools. That's something that we talk about more in History 1302, because a lot of people have pointed out that this leads to huge gaps in educational quality, because you're pinning the funding of a school to the general wealth of the community, and therefore leaving poor kids kind of out in the cold. But this failure to see education as a public good in Southern states before the Civil War is part of the reason why we don't see a public school system in Southern states before the Civil War. They will start after the Civil War during Reconstruction, which we'll talk a little bit more about the last week of our semester. So these are just some examples that I mentioned today of reform movements. Again, please read more in your textbook about the abolition and women's rights movements, which again come out of this time period and are actually linked to one another. And I will post up on Blackboard the link to the American feminism video that I've earlier done about this time period. Thank you all so much. I'll see you next time.